Hello everyone, welcome to #ShareAStory. My name's Paul Dunn and I'm currently playing Dame Gertie Gossip in The Adventures of Robin Hood here in Durham. But today I would like to share a story with you that I've written, which is called simply Vanessa and George. Deep in the heart of Northumbria, where the little river meanders through the rolling hills of the Coquet Valley, there lived a little girl whose name was Vanessa. Vanessa had always been a very good little girl since the day she was born. She was good at her schoolwork and did as she was told and completed all her chores, but as well as that, she loved to help everyone in the village. She would help the farmers to feed their sheep and birth their lambs in the spring. She would run errands and deliver groceries to the older people of the village, and she would be very helpful to the walkers and ramblers who trod the hills of Northumbria, telling them where they were if they were lost and showing them where was best to see the most beautiful sights of the land. She was a source of great pride to her mother and was the apple of her father's eye. Yep. Vanessa really was a very good girl indeed, and all the village thought so. Every winter, when a blanket of snow would cover the fields and the hills and the rooftops of the village, Vanessa could be seen outside playing in the snow. She would build snowmen and throw snowballs with her friends and fly down the side of the hills on her sledge, laughing and cheering and screaming with delight as she went. She really was a joy to behold. But in the winter of Vanessa's 10th birthday, she was nowhere to be seen on her sledge on the hills of Northumbria. Nor had she been seen in the spring helping with the lambs, or in the summer helping the ramblers on their countryside treks. Vanessa hadn't been seen being very helpful at all. In fact, Vanessa had become very, very naughty. It was springtime, and all the lambs on Farmer Gilmore's farm had been born happy and healthy, no thanks to Vanessa, who hadn't come along to help Farmer Gilmore with his lambing this spring. The sun was shining, there was a pleasant warmth in the air, and all the lambs and sheep were standing in the field, chewing happily on the lush green grass. They were so happy chomping on their grass that they didn't see a mischievous little head pop up above the hedge. It was Vanessa, and she had had an idea. She crept along the hedge at the edge of the field, all the way to where the big 5-bar gate stood. The gate led to a steep bank which sloped downwards towards the river, as well as to many little nooks and crannies and caves. The gate was closed, of course, to keep the sheep and lambs safely in their field, but Vanessa had thought, wouldn't it be funny to let all the sheep and lambs out and let them run down to the river and have a drink? And so she unhooked the latch, swung the huge 5-bar gate open, and then ran around the field, clapping and shouting to chase the sheep and lambs out of the gate towards the bank. A little while later, while Vanessa was sitting under one of Farmer Gilmore's apple trees, eating a pile of his apples that she'd picked without his permission, Farmer Gilmore saw her and came storming over to her. His face was bright red, and it looked like he might explode that he was so angry. "Vanessa!" Farmer Gilmore shouted. "What on earth were you thinking? My wife saw you from the farmhouse window, opening the gate, chasing all the sheep out of the field. I can't believe you would be so naughty." Well, Vanessa had never seen Farmer Gilmore this angry before. She was a little taken aback. "I just let them out for a drink," Vanessa said meekly. "You should know better, Vanessa. It's much too dangerous for them to go down there to the river, and I couldn't get there in time by myself to save them all. Now I've lost some of my lambs, and the ones I have still got, well, they've lost their mothers, because I couldn't save all the sheep either." Vanessa suddenly felt awful. "I'm sorry," she cried. I really didn't mean to do it. It wasn't my fault. It was George. George made me do it." Farmer Gilmore shook his head and looked very angrily indeed at Vanessa before turning his back and stomping off back up to his field to feed the few sheep and lamb that he did have left. Vanessa sat under that apple tree and all by herself, and for a full half hour cried. But a little time went by, and Vanessa soon forgot about her misdemeanour with Farmer Gilmore's sheep, and before she knew it, she was in trouble again. This time, when some particularly novice ramblers had asked her which was the best way to go, she sent them in completely the wrong direction, all the way up a particularly treacherous mountain. They had to wait hours for help. They were completely cut off. When they were finally found by the mountain rescue team, they were lifted to safety by helicopter, but they told of a little girl called Vanessa, who had told them that that was the best and safest way to go.
"What's got into you these days, Vanessa?" said Jim Mackay, the head of the mountain rescue team. "You know these hills and mountains as well as all of us. You know that was a dangerous place to send those people. They could have been very seriously injured, or even worse, killed."
"I'm sorry," Vanessa cried, feeling very silly and very sorry. "It was George's fault. George told me to do it." Well, by now, this had gone on long enough. Vanessa had got up to dozens of naughty little escapades like this, causing all kinds of problems and inconveniences for the people of the village, and every time she had said that it was this George who had made her do it. Vanessa's parents and the other important grown-ups of the village got together one day to discuss Vanessa and her wayward behaviour. "I've asked all round her friends' parents," Vanessa's mother said. "There's no one in her friendship group called George." "Well, I've checked the parish records," said Reverend Foreman, "and there's been no one christened George in the village in the last 11 years.
"And I've looked up the town hall records," said the councillor Broggett, "and since old George Potts, the ferret wrangler, left 20 years ago, there's not even a single person in the village called George." The adults all sat and stared at each other and scratched their heads and looked perplexed and wondered about Vanessa's strange behaviour. Just who on earth was this George? George was a woodland pixie. He lived in a copse in the middle of Farmer Gilmore's cabbage field on the outskirts of the village, along with his tribe of fellow pixies and sprites and nymphs and other woodland creatures. His full pixie name was Roscoe Maximilian Torremalina, but deep down he thought that was a bit of a silly name and far too grand for a simple pixie like him, so he preferred to be called by his nickname, George. Now, not many people know this, but the fantastical woodland creatures of Northumbria live in a very strict hierarchy. They start off as just a sprite, then it goes imp, pixie, nymph, and finally, right at the top, fairy. Now, as we've already said, George was a pixie, but George had also reached his 10th pixie birthday, which meant that he was allowed to try to become a nymph, as long as he could pass his very difficult nymph test. It was decided that a small gang of his fellow pixies, along with one or two older nymphs, would set George's test and watch to see how well he did with it. "What shall we make him do?" said one of the gang of pixies. "Let's make him gallop around the whole perimeter of the cabbage field on the back of a stag," said another pixie.
"Or get him to trek all the way to the borderland and steal a tartan pixie flag." The pixies all clapped and laughed and rubbed their tiny little hands together, but the nymphs in the gang just quietly smiled and shook their heads. "No, no, no, no," they said cunningly. "We have a much better idea." And so it was decided that George's task would be to appear to one of the very good little girls in the village and turn her into a very naughty little girl. George wasn't very sure at all that he would like this nymph test.
I'm not sure I want to do that, actually,
he said meekly. The other pixies and nymphs just laughed.
Are you scared?
Said one of the pixies.
What a wimp,
said another pixie. Then the oldest nymph put his arm around George's shoulder and said, "Come on, you want to be a nymph, don't you? You want to be one of us?" And the thing was, George did want to be one of them. He really did want to be a nymph. And so, even though he thought he really wasn't sure he was doing the right thing, he agreed to complete the nymph test. Now, the fantastical woodland creatures of Northumbria can't usually just appear to normal boys and girls. In order to do so, they need to have a sprinkling of magical fairy dust dashed over them. "Don't worry," said the oldest nymph in the gang. "My Uncle Fleshmount is a fairy. I'll nick some of his dust." And that is exactly what he did. And later, that very same day, Roscoe Maximilian Torremolina, better known as George the Pixie, appeared to Vanessa for the very first time. She was standing at the edge of Farmer Gilmore's field, just watching the sheep and lambs feeding on the luscious green grass, when suddenly she heard a very quiet but very clear. She looked around, and there, down at her feet, standing no taller than the top of her socks, was a strange little woodland creature.
Hello,
he said in a friendly voice.
I'm George.
Hello, George, said Vanessa, a little bemused, but also very curious. Who are you?
I'm a woodland pixie. Can I be your friend?
Well, of course, said Vanessa. I've never had a pixie for a friend before.
Oh, it's ever so much fun, said George. I'll be your best friend ever.
And for the next 10 minutes or so, they both chatted excitedly and became very good friends. George liked Vanessa very much and was really enjoying himself with her. But then, in the distance, he saw the gang of pixies and nymphs hiding behind a tree stump, watching him with angry, impatient expressions on their faces. He remembered why he was there. He remembered the nymph test.
Wouldn't it be fun, Vanessa, he said, to open the gate at the bottom of the field and let out all of the sheep and lambs?
Oh, Vanessa replied, I'm not so sure about that.
No, of course it would. And they could all have a good old run around rather than being cooped up in this same boring old field. And they could have a nice fresh drink in the river.
But won't Farmer Giles be very cross? Vanessa asked.
No, he'll be grateful. You'll be helping him out by giving his flock some exercise.
Vanessa bit her bottom lip as she thought about George's suggestion.
Come on, said George. I'll do it with you. It'll be fun, I promise.
And so that was the start of Vanessa's naughty streak. That was how she first let the sheep and the lambs out of the field, and how it all ended so badly, with Farmer Gilmore being very cross indeed with Vanessa. The same thing had happened with the ramblers, who got lost up the mountain and had to be rescued.
Won't it be fun to confuse them and send them in the wrong direction?
George had said. Again, Vanessa really wasn't very sure at first and didn't think she was doing the right thing. But her new friend persuaded her.
Oh, they'll be all right in the end, and they'll thank you for showing them some new mountains that they've never explored before. It'll be an adventure for them.
But of course it wasn't. And again, Vanessa had got into trouble, just as she did all the other times that she did something naughty which George had told her to do. Now, George, meanwhile, desperately wanted to pass his nymph test. Not just to become a nymph, but also to stop making Vanessa do all these naughty things. Deep down in his heart, He knew she shouldn't really be doing them, and he didn't like seeing her being told off by the grown-ups all the time. Every time he completed one of the tasks that the gang had set him, he looked over to them in the hope that he would get the sign that he had passed his test. But instead, they would just be rolling around on the floor or slapping each other on the back, laughing loudly and pointing at George. So, by the time that winter came around and the snow was starting to fall, George was unhappy because he still wasn't a nymph. And Vanessa was unhappy because she had lost the trust of all of the village, and most of her friends had stopped wanting to play with her. One cold day at dusk, she was forlornly sledging down the hill all by herself. The gang of pixies and nymphs were watching from behind a nearby haystack. They began to nudge George. "Go on, George. One last task. Yeah, George, a fine big trick. You know you want to." "The bridge in the village," said the oldest nymph. "You have to make her pour loads of cold water all over it. It'll all freeze over, and then everybody will slip and slide all over the place and fall down, hurt themselves. It'll be a riot." The rest of the gang of pixies and nymphs joined in the cruel laughter, but George really wasn't sure. "You do want to be one of us, don't you?" said the oldest nymph again. And so, reluctantly, George appeared to Vanessa again, and, just like he had done all the other times, persuaded her to go along with his plan, which he said would be fun, even though he really wasn't so sure anymore. Vanessa and George got to the bridge, which was the only way in and out of the village. Just beyond the bridge, Vanessa noticed that a fallen tree, which must have been brought down in the storm that had happened the night before, was blocking the road. "Shall I get you some water from the river?" George said. "Then we can make this ice rink." Okay, said Vanessa. But just then, they heard a faint cry from a little further down the riverbank. "Help! Is someone there? Can you help me?" Vanessa and George looked at each other. It sounds like someone's in trouble," Vanessa said. "What should we do?" George looked over at his gang of pixies, who were watching and laughing and snorting, willing him to get up to even more mischief. And in that moment, George decided something. It was very clear and very definite, and as soon as he thought it, he felt like a huge weight had been lifted from his shoulders. "We should go and get help," George said. What about our game?" said Vanessa. The water and the bridge and the ice rink?" George glanced over at the gang once more, and then he shook his head. "We shouldn't do that, Vanessa. You should go and help." And so they both ran down to where the cries for help were coming from. When they got there, they found one of the ramblers who Vanessa had got into trouble that summer. She'd been out for a walk, slipped down the riverbank and hurt herself very badly. It looked like her leg was broken. She was in a lot of pain and she couldn't move. "What should I do?" Vanessa said to George, although to the rambler it seemed like she was just talking out loud to herself. "I don't know what to do." "You learned first aid in the Go Guides, haven't you?" said George. "Of course," said Vanessa. Looking around, she found a strong, straight branch that had fallen from a tree. She then tore up her jacket and made a makeshift splint, which she fixed to the rambler's leg. "There," she said, "that should do for now." She might need some food to keep her strength up," George suggested. "Yes," said Vanessa, and gave the rambler a bar of chocolate from her pocket. "Oh, thank you," said the rambler, gratefully chomping on the bar of chocolate. "You'll need an ambulance," Vanessa continued, and then she remembered. "Oh no, the road into the village is blocked."
"Oh, it's all right," said George. "Run to Farmer Gilmore's house. He can drive his tractor down here and then move the tree. And meanwhile, his wife can telephone for the ambulance."
"Perfect," Vanessa exclaimed. And then she said to the Rambler, "Don't worry, I won't be long. George will look after you." And as Vanessa ran at full speed off to Farmer Gilmore's house, the Rambler sat there, looking around and wondering to herself, "Who's George?" Well, thankfully, everything turned out well. Vanessa got to the farmhouse and told them what had happened. Farmer Gilmore drove down and moved the tree, and the ambulance was able to get through, take the Rambler to hospital, where her leg mended perfectly well, and the road was now even clear for a huge delivery of Christmas food and presents to be made to the village, which otherwise would have had to have simply turned round and driven away again. The people of the village were overjoyed and very grateful. And once again, Vanessa's parents were so proud of her. "Well done indeed," Councillor Broggett said to Vanessa the next day when they all met in the village hall. "For once this year, Vanessa, you were a very good girl and you did the right thing." "Thank you," Vanessa said, "but it was George, really. George made me do it." Well, the villagers laughed and shook their heads and ruffled Vanessa's hair a little bit. They still didn't know who on earth this George was, but they were all just very glad, and in fact, so was Vanessa, that he had helped her back to being the happy, caring, good little girl that she always used to be. And as for Roscoe Maximilian Torremolina, well, for one thing, he never ever used that name again. From then on, he was always just simply plain George. And he never became a nymph either. But that was fine by him. He decided that if that's what nymphs were like, then he really didn't want to be one after all. And in fact, he soon discovered that many of his pixie friends also didn't want to be nymphs like that either. And together they moved away from the copse in the cabbage field, and they found themselves a new home in some dense woodland near Farmer Gilmore's field, where they could keep an eye on his flock and make sure that it never again wandered down to the river. And the best thing of all, because he was still a pixie, the magic fairy dust still clung to him just a little bit. And so he was still able to appear to Vanessa. He couldn't do it as much these days because he had been chosen to be the leader of his new pixie friends, and so he had a lot of very important and busy work, making sure that they were all happy and healthy and fit and well. But every winter from then on, when Vanessa went up to the top of the hill with her friends to play and sledge down over the snow, George would be there, watching from behind a little tree stump. And Vanessa would just catch sight of him, and she would smile and wave, and he would smile and wave back. And in that moment, they both felt the true feeling of happiness and true friendship, and of doing the right thing. And that was the most wonderful feeling that they ever had in their whole lives. Well, I hope you enjoyed that hashtag share a story from Roundabout Dramatherapy. And if you would like to make a donation to support the work of Roundabout, we would be very, very grateful for your support. A small gift will make such a big difference to the children and adults that they support. Thank you.